In my field of developmental trauma, there is a foundational principle. There are no monsters, only symptoms. For 22 years, my work as a child psychologist was a form of translation. I took the silent, often violent language of trauma, the compulsive scratching, the vacant stares, the drawings of shadowed figures with no faces, and I translated it back into the logical lexicon of cause and effect. A child who could not speak was not an enigma. He was a library of unread books. A girl who screamed at an empty corner was not seeing ghosts. She was projecting a memory onto the canvas of the present. Every puzzle, no matter how complex, had a solution rooted in the observable, the diagnosable, the knowable. My entire career was built on the steadfast belief that the human mind, for all its labyrinthine complexity, adhered to a set of rules. My job was simply to uncover them. To do this work effectively, I lived by a single, unbreakable rule. Maintain. Clinical detachment. This was not a matter of coldness, but of clarity. Emotional involvement is a fog that obscures data, turning a diagnostician into a participant. You cannot solve a puzzle if you allow yourself to become one of the pieces. I had guided children through the echoes of unspeakable abuse and neglect, piecing together their fractured narratives from smudges of crayon and half-formed gestures. I had sat with boys who believed they were made of glass, and girls who hid, food for a famine that existed only in their past. In every case, I remained the analyst, the calm center in their storm, and in every case, the storm eventually passed, revealing the clear, rational shoreline of a treatable condition. This methodology had never failed me. That is, until the autumn I was asked to consult on the case of a 7-year-old girl at the Bridgewater Institute. Her name was Lily. This account is not a clinical paper. Its findings would never be published, and its conclusions would be dismissed as madness. I write it now for a different reason entirely. I write it as a record, and perhaps as a warning. My life has been one of protocol and evidence, of building solid walls of reason to contain the chaos of the human psyche. But the file I keep on Lily, locked in a drawer separate from all my other professional records, is the testament to the one case that breached those walls. It is the story of how my life's work was invalidated, and how I learned, with absolute and terrifying certainty, that some doors within the human mind are not meant to be opened. The call from Dr. Alistair Thorne at the Bridgewater Institute came on a Tuesday. Alistair was a neurologist, a man who viewed the brain as a magnificent, intricate machine, and for whom any problem of the mind was ultimately a problem of wiring. He was brilliant, grounded, and not prone to exaggeration, which was why his words carried such weight. Alistair, he'd said, his voice tight with a frustration that bordered on exhaustion. We have one I think you need to see. All our scans are clean. All our tests are negative. But she's elsewhere. Completely. My drive to Bridgewater took me 20 miles outside the city, where the suburbs gave way to a dense, quiet expanse of forest. The institute itself rose from the trees like a geological anomaly, a monolith of glass and steel, its lines clean and severe against the wild chaos of nature. The air inside was cool, sterile, and smelled faintly of antiseptic and ozone. It was a place built to impose order on the unpredictable. Alistair met me, his face etched with the kind of weariness I recognized in doctors who had run out of answers. She's in observation too, he said, leading me down a long white corridor. 7 years old, found wandering on a highway 3 months ago. No family has come forward, no response to any stimuli. She just draws. I entered the observation room through a two-way mirror. The room was soft-walled and sparsely furnished with a small table and chair. And there was Lily. She was a small girl with pale hair, sitting perfectly still at the table. She wasn't frightened or sad. She was simply absent. a vessel with no one at the helm. Her hand, holding a dark blue crayon, moved with a steady, mechanical rhythm across a sheet of paper, the soft, waxy scratching the only sound in the room. Scattered around her were dozens of other drawings. I picked one up. It was a technically precise rendering of a tree, but every leaf was identical, every branch perfectly symmetrical. It was a drawing devoid of life, an anatomical diagram rather than a child's artwork. My first task, as always, was to establish a baseline, to search for the symbolic language in these images that might point to her trauma. I was looking for a recurring motif, a shadowed house, a falling figure, anything that would give me a foothold. As you can see, neurologically, she's a ghost, Aris murmured from beside me, his eyes fixed on the monitors displaying her vitals, heart rate, respiration, brain activity, all at levels just above a coma state. Yet she produces these. He gestured to the drawings. I watched as Lily finished her current piece. It was a picture of the large, plate glass window that made up the far wall of the observation room. In her drawing, a jagged starburst crack emanated from the center of the pane. Resting on the sill outside, rendered in that same disquieting detail, was a single blue jay, its head bent at an unnatural angle. I looked at the real window. It was a flawless, solid sheet of glass. A morbid fantasy, perhaps, Aris mused. A symbolic representation of being broken or trapped. It was a reasonable hypothesis. And then it happened. A deafening crack exploded through the room, sharp and violent, making both Aris and me flinch. We stared at the window. A fracture, identical to the one in Lily's drawing, was now spiderwebbing across the glass. Down on the lawn below, a groundskeeper was staring up at us, his lawnmower now silent, a look of horror on his face. Before either of us could process the impossibility of it, a secondary, softer sound followed, a sickening little thud against the pane. A blue jay, likely startled by the noise, had flown directly into the newly weakened glass. It slid down the pane and came to rest on the sill outside, its neck broken, its body still. Aris let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for a full minute. He even managed a weak, unconvincing laugh. "Well," he stammered, his scientific composure shattered. "That's a 1 in a million coincidence." But I wasn't listening. I was watching Lily, who had already taken a fresh sheet of paper and had begun to draw again, utterly unmoved. For the first time in my 22-year career, I felt a cold dread seep into my bones, a feeling that the protocols were irrelevant, that I was standing on the edge of a map where the known world simply ended. The concept of a 1 in a million coincidence is a balm for the rational mind, a statistical outlier that allows the world to continue making sense. But two such coincidences demand a new hypothesis. The incident with the window had pushed Aris and me out of the comfortable realm of psychology and neurology and into a grey, uncharted territory. To navigate it, we had to revert to the most fundamental tenet of the scientific method: control the variables. If Lily was somehow perceiving her environment through an unknown sense, we had to eliminate the environment itself. We moved our sessions to a level 5 observation suite in the Institute's research wing, a room within a room, soundproofed, shielded from electromagnetic interference, and monitored by a closed-circuit system. There were no windows, no external stimuli. It was a sensory vacuum, a black box. For the test, I chose an object of profound personal significance, something Lily could not possibly have encountered. From my briefcase, I removed my grandfather's silver pocket watch. It was a heavy, ornate thing from the turn of the last century, its face yellowed with age. Critically, it bore a unique imperfection, a tiny hairline scratch just to the left of the Roman numeral 9. the result of a fall decades before I was born. I placed it inside an opaque, sealed container and set it on the table in front of her. My heart hammered against my ribs with a strange mix of clinical anticipation and a dread I refused to name. Through the monitor in the next room, Aris and I watched. Lily did not look at the box. She did not acknowledge my presence. Her eyes remained fixed on the blank paper as her crayon began to move. The weight was excruciating. The only sound was the hum of the ventilation and the faint scratching from the other room, a sound that felt impossibly loud in the tense silence. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Finally, she stopped. I re-entered the room and picked up the paper. My breath caught in my throat. It was the watch. Not a childish approximation, but a near-perfect replica, from the filigree on the casing to the delicate curl of the hands. And there, rendered with a single, precise press of the crayon, was the scratch next to the ninth. It was a detail so small, so specific, it served as a signature of the impossible. I felt a wave of vertigo, the sickening sensation of solid ground, turning to quicksand beneath my feet. In the monitor room, Aris simply stared, his face pale. The word coincidence was no longer part of our vocabulary. "Get her to neuroimaging," he said, his voice a strained whisper. "Now, I have to see what her brain is doing. Before we proceed, it is important to understand what we were looking for. A functional magnetic resonance imaging, or fMRI, is not like a simple photograph. It's a dynamic map of the brain at work. By tracking the flow of oxygenated blood, it shows us which regions are active during a given task. If you are imagining a creative design, for example, your prefrontal cortex and visual association areas will light up in a specific, well-documented pattern. If you are recalling a vivid, established memory, say, the face of your mother, an entirely different network activates, one deeply rooted in the hippocampus. We placed Lily in the machine, the great white cylinder humming around her, and gave her a drawing pad. We simply needed to know, was her brain creating, or was it remembering? The results that scrolled across Aris's monitor were not just anomalous. They were a declaration of war against the known laws of neurology. As Lily drew, the regions of her brain associated with imagination remained dark. The areas for real-time sensory input were dormant. Instead, the screen glowed with frantic activity in the hippocampus and the neocortex. It was the unmistakable, textbook signature of deep memory retrieval. Aris, a man who had read tens of thousands of brain scans, just shook his head, his mouth slightly agape. "It's not possible," he breathed. "It makes no sense." The data was telling us that Lily was not inventing these images. She was, with profound accuracy, recalling them. The only way I could process the information was through an analogy. Imagine a sculptor, blindfolded, who has been asked to create a statue of a person they have never met or even heard described. Yet their hands move with unerring confidence, carving a perfect likeness from the stone. An fMRI of their brain, according to all known science, should show the regions for artistry, for spatial construction, for imagination, burning with activity. But what if the scan showed something else? What if it showed only the calm, simple pattern of a person remembering every curve and contour of a statue they had seen 1,000 times before? That is what we were seeing in Lily's brain. She wasn't creating something new. She was simply transcribing a memory of something she had, by all physical laws, never witnessed. The scientific anomaly was now a chasm. Aris, pushed far beyond the limits of his specialty, began to spend his nights buried in arcane journals, muttering about quantum entanglement and theoretical biology, desperate for any scientific framework, no matter how fringe, to contain what we had witnessed. For my part, the wall of clinical detachment I had spent a career building had begun to crumble. This was no longer a case file. It was an obsession that followed me home. I would sit in my study late at night. The official case notes spread before me, but my eyes would be on the photocopies of her drawings, the perfect leaves, the cracked window, the silver watch. I felt a creeping, paternal dread for this hollowed-out child. But something more selfish too, a primal fear. I was no longer just her doctor. I was an investigator staring into an abyss, and I was beginning to feel the terrifying, distinct sensation of the abyss staring back. The human mind can adapt to almost anything, even the impossible. After the revelation of the fMRI, a new, surreal protocol settled over our work. The impossible was no longer a matter of if, but when and what. A few days after the scan, the nature of Lily's drawings shifted. They evolved from static objects to dynamic events, brief narrative vignettes drawn with that same unnerving, soulless precision. A drawing of a dropped tray in the cafeteria was followed. 3 hours later, by the clatter of ceramic on tile, a drawing of a flickering light in the west corridor preceded a maintenance call by a full day. My role had changed. I was no longer a psychologist. I was an archivist of the inevitable, documenting each small prophecy with time-stamped photographs and cross-referenced notes. The most jarring example came the following Tuesday. Lily produced a drawing of Clara, a kindly, middle-aged nurse, in the middle of the hallway. In the image, Clara's face was a mask of surprise, her hands empty, and a tray was depicted mid-fall. On the polished linoleum floor, a splash of dark. Coffee had blossomed into a distinct five-pointed star shape. I logged the drawing at 9:17 a.m. For the rest of the morning, I felt a knot of anxiety tighten in my stomach. It was one thing to see an inanimate object predicted, but another entirely to wait for a specific person to fulfill a scripted misfortune. At 11:23 a.m., I was walking toward the staff lounge when I heard a sudden gasp and the sharp clatter of a tray hitting the floor. I rounded the corner to see Clara, flustered and apologetic, dabbing at the floor with paper towels. At her feet, a pool of dark coffee was spreading. Its shape, for a horrifying, perfect moment before she wiped it away, was a five-pointed star. Presented my growing file of evidence, a meticulous chronicle of the impossible, to Aris that afternoon. He looked haggard, his clinical composure worn thin, replaced by the frantic energy of a man trying to solve a cosmic riddle with the wrong tools. "There has to be a physical explanation, Alistair," he insisted, running a hand through his already disheveled hair. "Think about it. This institute is a closed system. The air pressure, the electrical grid, the acoustics, they all produce subtle, rhythmic patterns. What if her traumatized brain has developed a form of extreme, subconscious pattern recognition? What if she's processing thousands of micro-cues, the vibration of someone's gait, the change in air current as a door opens, and her brain is assembling it all into a high-probability predictive model? I understood what he was doing. He was building a final, desperate fortress of reason, using the bricks of fringe science to hold back the tide of the supernatural. His theory was elegant, even beautiful in its own way, a testament to his unwillingness to surrender to the irrational. But it was not enough. "Aris," I said gently, "a change in air pressure can't tell you the specific shape of a coffee." Splash. A vibration in the floor can't predict a Y-shaped crack in a window. His theory could account for the what, perhaps, but never the breathtaking, irrefutable specificity of the how. It was the last gasp of a dying paradigm, and we both knew it. The monster was no longer outside the gates, it was in the room with us. That evening, I left the institute feeling drained, a hollowed-out feeling I'd never known in my professional life. The obsession had taken root. I was replaying every drawing, every event, every impossible data point in my mind as I drove the dark, winding road home. The towering oaks of the surrounding forest loomed over the asphalt like ancient, silent witnesses. My phone chimed with a text message, its small screen a startling splash of light in the darkness. It was from Aris. There was no text, only an attached image. I opened it. My blood turned to ice. It was a new drawing from Lily. The image was of a car, a dark sedan identical to my own. Its front end crumpled violently against the trunk of a massive oak tree. The tree was distinctive, its upper branches scarred and blackened from a long-ago lightning strike. It was a drawing of a brutal, fatal impact. My mind reeled, trying to process the image, the sheer malevolence of its content. It felt different. This wasn't a spilled coffee. This was death. I looked up from my phone, my eyes refocusing on the road ahead. Bathed in the twin beams of my headlights, no more than 200 feet away around a sharp bend, stood the tree. Its gnarled, lightning-scarred, branches clawed at the night sky, a perfect match for the drawing on my screen. My professional horror, the intellectual terror of a scientist witnessing the impossible, evaporated in an instant, replaced by a raw, animal fear. A dark shape exploded from the woods to my right. A deer. My foot slammed onto the brake pedal. The tires screamed in protest, the smell of burning rubber filling the car as it lurched and fishtailed, finally screeching to a halt. The silence that followed was absolute. My bumper was inches from the rough, dark bark of the oak tree. I sat there for a long time, my hands shaking, my heart hammering a painful rhythm against my ribs. This was no longer a case I was studying. I was a character in its narrative, and the phenomenon had just crossed the line from being something I was observing to something that was observing me. My car remained by the side of the road, a monument to a reality that no longer existed. I don't remember the call, but somehow Aris was there, his own headlights cutting through the darkness, his face a ghostly white mask of fear. The drive back to the Bridgewater Institute was a silent, high-speed blur. I was no longer a doctor, a man of science returning to his work. I was a victim returning to the scene of the crime, or perhaps more accurately, to the weapon itself. My body was trembling with a post-adrenaline chill, my thoughts a chaotic scramble. The neat, orderly corridors of my mind had been ransacked, its furniture overturned, its books set ablaze. When we entered the observation suite, the atmosphere had transformed. The sterile clinical room now felt heavy, sacrosanct, like the inner chamber of a temple dedicated to some ancient, unknowable god. The air was thick with a silence that felt older and more profound than the soundproofing could account for. It was an altar, and Lily, sitting at its center, was its oblivious oracle. She was already working on a new drawing, the soft scratch of her crayon the only sound in a world that had gone completely quiet. "All of them," I said, my voice hoarse, unrecognizable. "Get all of them." Aris, moving with the slow, deliberate motions of a man in shock, began gathering every drawing Lily had made since her arrival. We cleared the large central table and began laying them out, one by one, under the cold, humming lights. We arranged them chronologically, creating a timeline of our descent into madness. At first, they seemed disconnected. A tree, a cracked window, a silver watch. Then came the drawings of the Institute itself, the flickering light, the spilled coffee. It was here, seeing them all together, that the pattern began to scream at us. The events were not random. They were closing in. They were mapping my path through the building, documenting events happening in my immediate vicinity, on my periphery. The focus was tightening, like a lens twisting into a sharp, terrible clarity. Aris and I didn't speak. We pointed with shaking fingers, our eyes meeting across the tableau of paper, sharing a singular, horrifying understanding. The final images confirmed it. My car, my route home, the the specific tree. This was not a random series of prophecies. This was a narrative. It was a story being told in reverse, and I was its protagonist. The thematic horror I had been grappling with academically, the limits of science, the nature of time, now became a suffocating personal reality. The foundation of my identity, the belief in my own free will, crumbled to dust. I looked at the drawings, this storyboard of my recent past, and understood with sickening certainty that my actions had not been my own. My decision to stay late, my choice of route home, every step that led me to that tree had been a pre-written line in a script. I was a puppet, and this silent, vacant child was somehow showing me my own strings. The ultimate psychological horror is not the monster in the dark. It is the realization that the path you walk is not a path at all, but a groove worn into the floor of a cage. I felt a crushing weight, the existential dread of a man who looks in the mirror and realizes for the first time that the person looking back is not in control. As this wave of despair washed over me, Lily stopped drawing. The rhythmic scratching ceased, and the silence that rushed in to fill the void was absolute. She did not look at us. She did not present the drawing. She simply set her crayon down, folded her small hands in her lap, and returned to her state of perfect, unnerving emptiness. The drawing lay face down on the table. For a moment, neither Aris nor I could move. It felt like the final page of a book I'd been forced to read, a conclusion I did not want, but could not avoid. With a hand that did not feel like my own, I reached out and turned it over. It was my face. It was a portrait, rendered with a level of detail that was anatomically flawless and utterly terrifying. But it was not me as I was. The skin had the waxy, translucent pallor of a body in a morgue. The eyes, wide and staring, were clouded over, holding a profound and final emptiness. There was no life, no spark, no consciousness. It was a perfect, clinical depiction of death. And there, on the forehead, drawn with a single, precise line, was a detail that made my stomach clench with a cold, chemical nausea. A Y-shaped incision, the mark of a coroner's autopsy. I stared at the image of my own dead, desecrated face, and that is when it happened. A searing, electric pain erupted behind my left eye, a flash of white-hot agony that was not psychological but brutally, physically, real. The world dissolved into a smear of light and colour. My vision narrowed to a tunnel. In that final, explosive moment of agony, as the systems of my own body began their catastrophic failure, the truth was unveiled. It came not as a thought, but as a silent, instantaneous understanding. Not a prophet, a receiver. Her brain is an antenna, picking up a signal. Not the future, an echo, a memory. The strongest memories. Trauma. Death. Whose death? The image of my own face on the paper flashed in my mind. My death. It's my memory. The loop closed with the force of a physical blow. Lily wasn't predicting my death. She had been receiving its echo all along. The massive bioelectrical and emotional discharge of my own final moments was the powerful signal that had been broadcasting backward through time. My end was the source of her beginning. The catastrophic cerebral aneurysm that was now bursting in my brain was not the result of the prophecy. It was the cause of it. The last thing I saw was Aris's face, his mouth open in a scream, his eyes wide with a horror that perfectly mirrored my own. As the floor rushed up to meet me and the world went black, my first conscious memory is of the colour white, the sterile ceiling tiles of a hospital room, the starched sheets, the pristine uniform of a nurse adjusting my IV drip. My last memory had been of a cataclysm of pain and a terrifying, absolute truth. This quiet, ordered reality felt like a fiction. I did not die. That is the simple, improbable fact of the matter. The paradox of my situation is that my life was saved by the very phenomenon that predicted its end. Aris's immediate, frantic response, the Institute's state-of-the-art medical wing, the sheer luck of having one of the nation's top neurosurgeons on call, all of it conspired to pull me back from an edge I had already, in a sense, fallen over. The aneurysm was real. It had ruptured catastrophically. The surgeons who operated described the damage with a detached clinical awe. I spent 3 weeks in a coma, my body tethered to this world by humming machines while my mind drifted in a silent, dreamless void. Upon my recovery, I was faced with a final professional duty. I had to write the official report on the case of Lily. The Institute's board required it. My career required it. The edifice of modern science required it. And so, I sat at my desk for days, a man who had glimpsed the impossible machinery behind the curtain of reality, and I constructed the most elaborate and profound lie of my life. I wrote that Lily presented a unique confluence of trauma-induced, savant syndrome, and a profound subliminal pattern recognition ability. I used all the correct terminology, citing obscure journals and hypothetical neurological pathways. I explained that her traumatized mind, stripped of conventional consciousness, had become a hyper-efficient processing engine, absorbing thousands of environmental micro-cues and assembling them into astonishingly accurate predictive models. It was plausible. It was scientific. It was a complete and utter fabrication, a carefully constructed fiction designed to paper over a crack in the foundations of the universe. I signed my name to that report with a sense of self-loathing so deep it felt like a physical illness. Aris co-signed it without protest. The experience had broken something in him too. He never spoke of fringe theories again. In fact, he never spoke of the case at all. He retreated back into the comforting solidity of testable, observable neurology, and I never saw him again after I left Bridgewater. As for Lily, the signal she had been receiving, the powerful, traumatic echo of my own impending death, ceased the moment the surgeons clipped the aneurysm in my brain. The broadcast was over. When I visited her a month later at the long-term state facility she'd been transferred to, the oracle was gone. The girl who had transcribed memories from the future was just a silent 7-year-old child in a pink dress, staring blankly at a wall. She never drew again. The antenna was still there, but the station had gone off the air. A week after that visit, I submitted my official report and my letter of resignation. I retired from psychology altogether. How could I continue? How could I sit with a patient and speak of the mind as a rational construct, a machine that could be understood and repaired? How could I counsel people to take control of their lives, to make their own choices, knowing that our existence might be nothing more than a closed loop, a story already written, whose ending can echo back to its beginning? My life's work was predicated on a lie, not a malicious one, but a lie of blissful ignorance. I could no longer, in good conscience, perpetuate it. I live a quiet life now. My survival is a cruel irony. My body was saved, but my worldview, the very core of my intellectual identity, was killed in that observation room. The true haunting is not the memory of a ghost or a demon. It is the permanent possession of a terrible knowledge. In my study, locked in a fireproof safe, I keep a single piece of paper, a high-resolution photograph of Lily's final drawing, the portrait of my own dead face. Sometimes, late at night, I take it out. I look into my own lifeless eyes, at the cold, clinical mark of the coroner's blade on my forehead. It is not a reminder of a death that was avoided, but of a death that was. Its echo was real enough to be captured by a broken child and transcribed in crayon. I am alive, but I live every day with the profound existential vertigo of a man who has received a memory from his own grave and now understands that the line between life and death, past and future, is not a line at all. It is a circle,